Hello everyone, and welcome back to Round the Cauldron. I'm so happy to be back after my break, and I hope you enjoy this welcome back episode. I have a few new things planned for the podcast, including different segments that will tie in with the entire episode. These may occasionally change, but I'm going to try to stick to at least a tarot card for the month, the next month's moon phases and holidays, and answering a listener question or two. The audio might also be a bit different as I adjust and move forward. Also, to help with my dissociation, I've started creating scripts, so hopefully I don't lose my train of thought too much. Without further ado, let's get started. First things first, it is time for our monthly forecast. This is going to be a segment where I talk about the coming moon phases, retrogrades, Sabbats, and other important holidays and events. Eventually, this may include important astrological transits, but I'm an astrology newbie and not ready for that yet. So what do we have to look forward to in June? We are currently going through Mercury retrograde. This started on May 29th and will end on June 22nd. If you're not familiar with Mercury retrograde, it's basically the time when Mercury appears to move backward in the sky. This happens a few times a year, so it isn't as rare as some people think. Mercury rules communication and all aspects surrounding it. This includes conversations and speaking, but also contracts and negotiations. During Mercury retrograde, try and be flexible and understanding with yourself and the people around you. Also, try not to sign any important documents or make any important contracts, negotiations, or deals during Mercury retrograde. We can't put a pause on our lives, but we can take a moment and think things through just a little bit longer. People in the spiritual community tend to blame absolutely everything on the retrograde when it happens, but I don't think that's entirely accurate. During the retrograde, take some time to reflect on your own styles of communication and what's important to you. We will be moving through the dark moon into the new moon on June 10th in the sign of Gemini. Gemini is an air sign and encompasses such concepts as intelligence and communication. If you're going to be performing any spells during this time, it's a good time for releasing things that no longer serve you or starting over. Bring that Gemini energy into your spells by focusing on communication and new ideas. Between the new moon and the full moon, we will see the celebration of the summer or winter solstice, depending on your hemisphere of residence. This year, the solstice will take place on Sunday, June 20th. During the solstice, we see the longest day and longest night of the year. This is our slow transition into the darker or lighter half of the year. The quote-unquote official Sabbats that separate the dark and light halves of the year are Bealtaine and Samhain. The solstice just sees us start to make that slow transition. Here in the northern hemisphere, the days will begin to get shorter while we soak up the summer sun. In the southern hemisphere, the days will get longer, but the bite of frost will slowly lose its potency. Next, we move through a full moon in Capricorn on June 24th and 25th. Capricorn is an earth sign, encompassing such concepts as practicality and hard work. The full moon is always seen as the height of the moon's power, good for just about any magical working. With the moon in Capricorn, you can center your spell work around things grounded in reality, as well as the hearth and home. This has been your monthly forecast. The information about zodiac magic comes from the book Fixed Star, Sign, and Constellation Magic by Christopher Warnock. Many thanks to the Old Farmer's Almanac for the date of the solstice. Okay. Today, I want to talk about the concept of spiritual growth, what it means for me, and why I believe it's important. Many thanks to my patrons on Patreon who voted for this topic. Thank you Rose, Jess, Hillary, Lee, Angie, Leli, Magical Crafting, Bliss, Beverly Butterfly, Jessica, and Jennifer. If you'd like a chance to vote on future topics, join me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and all links are in the show notes. I've been thinking about this topic for a while now, mulling over what it means to grow spiritually or to grow as a spiritual person. What does spiritual growth even mean? What does it look like? I'm hoping to give some answers from my own personal experience in today's episode. First, I think I need to define what I mean when I say spiritual. If we look at the dictionary definition of the term spiritual, we will find this: of or relating to the spirit or soul as distinguished from the physical nature. For me, I take this to mean my spiritual body, my soul, if you will, or astral body. To be spiritual means to have some belief in an outside force, whether that be God, an unnamed universe, other deities, or even a higher consciousness. Whatever that term is for you, that's what we're looking to grow a connection with. When I talk about spiritual growth, I don't necessarily mean what some people would call enlightenment or ascension. Those are terms that don't really fit my belief system. I'm not looking for enlightenment or ascension. I'm looking to be grounded in my reality and the reality of those around me. For me, spiritual growth involves digging deeper into my belief system and uncovering my truths. What do I believe to be true? What do I know about myself and how the world works? What is my purpose? And who am I really? As a pagan, my spirituality and my faith are intrinsically linked together. If I am to grow spiritually, I will most likely also grow in my faith and belief. Either that, some spiritual truth will be revealed to me that will lead me down a new path. Either way, growth is happening. Spiritual growth is essentially the process of becoming more and more aware of who you are in relation to the world around you. There are many different concepts that come into play for spiritual growth, and it would be impossible to get into the nuance of absolutely everything in one podcast episode. For me, spiritual growth is a way to grow my connection with myself and the divine to better serve the community around me. Spiritual growth allows me to cultivate compassion and empathy for my fellow living beings. It allows me to be aware of pain that I've caused or am currently causing and move through it, learning from my mistakes and being open to change and criticism in the future. Everyone is in different stages of spiritual growth. Some people are like that tiny seed just planted in the soil. They have a lot of work and growth to do before they can begin to see themselves in relation to everything else. Some people may have more growth to do than others, and some will have limited access to the resources they need for growth due to their circumstances. That's important to keep in mind. One person may be privileged to have access to the tools they need for growth, while others may be too busy worrying about where their next meal will come from. You can't focus on spiritual growth if your needs aren't met. This also brings up the topic of who spiritual growth benefits. Is it just for you? Or are you growing spiritually so that you can help lift others up too? There are systems in place in the United States that make things exceptionally harder for some people based on their race, their sex, their gender identity, and even their economic status. For me, spiritual growth is about growing myself so I can help grow others. The community as a whole needs to change, and the tools need to be available for everyone. And we can't do that if there are those who are more privileged than others standing at the top, holding the gates closed. Now, taking all of this into consideration, we can begin to see how spiritual growth happens and what it looks like. You can't be a passive participant in your own spiritual growth. It involves actually doing something. Think about it. If you plant a seed, you can't expect it to grow without proper nutrients in the soil, water for cell function, and sunlight for photosynthesis. Spiritual growth is going to involve many different tools and methods to get you from point A to point B. But if you don't use the tools you have, nothing is going to happen. But what does it look like? What does spiritual growth look like while you're doing it? Honestly, it can look like a whole lot of nothing in the moment. When you look back, though, that's when you can see the change with more clarity. That's when you realize that the slight adjustment of your daily routine led to more empathy, that the slight change in your manner of speech led to more clarity in your conversations. Spiritual growth doesn't have to be a massive upheaval of everything you've ever known. I mean, it can for sure. I know some people who have gone from one extreme of the spiritual spectrum to another. Shout out to you if you're listening. You know who you are. In my opinion, there are two different types of spiritual growth, and they both look different. The first type happens more slowly. It takes a longer period of time before you realize that any change has happened at all. I have noticed that this usually happens when you're around people that cultivate spiritual growth. Not every group of people will be as welcoming and open to growing spiritually, even if that's not what you call it. Your friends and family definitely have an impact on your growth, but we'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. Slow spiritual growth is gradual and less noticeable. It's one of those times where you don't even realize that something within you has changed until you look back on how you used to be. I think this is something we have all experienced. I know for sure that I have changed over the last 10 years. The other type of spiritual growth happens quickly. Usually this is because of a tower moment. A moment in your life where the foundations of everything you knew come crumbling down around you. This type of growth happens quickly because you can't rebuild your tower without a foundation. Without a foundation, you have nothing to stand on. This type of change is brought about usually by sudden upheaval. Something you knew to be true at one point, like prayer is just for Christianity, for example, smacked you in the forehead and said, "Hey, that's not true. Fix me." In my opinion, you can't have spiritual growth without at least one tower moment. The tower signifies something in your life that needed to change anyway because the foundation that it was built upon wasn't stable. It needed to crumble, and you needed to pick up the pieces to move forward. This is a change that is fast-paced. Something has to give way to make room for something else immediately in order for you to continue moving forward. I'm going to use an example from my personal experience to demonstrate what spiritual growth can look like, in my opinion. This first one is a story I've told before, and it's one that showcases a gradual spiritual change. When I started this podcast, it was supposed to be all about bringing Wicca to the forefront of society, teaching what I knew, and learning from others around me. The main focus, though, was Wicca. I had been Wiccan for years prior to starting this podcast, though not part of a tradition or initiated into a coven. Honestly, what I had to teach probably wasn't much different than what you can already find online. But anyway, I started this podcast as a Wiccan, and here I sit today, an Irish-focused Celtic pagan and eclectic witch, which is a mouthful. This is a spiritual shift that If you've listened to the podcast from the beginning, you probably saw or heard. Being online and learning about so many different things from people who walk so many different paths was eye-opening for me. People say that finding Wicca was like coming home. And in that sense, it was true for me too. But over the years, the glove of Wicca that used to fit so nicely for me started to stretch, to thin, and get worn down. Wicca no longer felt right. It no longer felt like a welcome home, more like a bus stop to the next destination. Through the process of learning about myself, what I want, and what I believe, I was able to grow spiritually into who I am today. I was able to discover things about myself and what I need out of my faith and what I have to give, and that's landed me right here in your ears. And this isn't the end of my journey either. Spiritual growth is an ever-present aspect of a spiritual person's life. This is just a small example of how, through self-discovery, shadow illumination, and introspection, I was able to find myself in a place that made me happier. Now, I mentioned a bit ago that I don't think spiritual growth can happen without at least one tower moment in your life. Keeping in mind that tower moments are subjective, I want to talk about a moment I had recently that made me confront a part of myself that isn't the easiest for me to look at. I have been working with and worshiping Bridget for almost 2 years now, I think. Something like that. And I have been wanting to do a formal dedication and devotion to her and her work. Every time I approach her about it, thinking that I have grown enough or learned enough and I'm ready, she undoubtedly shuts me down with a resounding no. Well, this past Bealtaina, I revisited the subject again with more of an open mind. A friend of mine had talked about their experience with contracts and deities, and I'd been seeing a few other things around the internet on the same subject. During a divination session, I brought this idea to Bridget. What card did I pull? The Nine of Swords reversed. Basically, she was telling me that I really needed to think about what I was asking for and really think about if I was ready. She showed me that even though this is what I thought I wanted, I was terrified that I wouldn't be able to hold up my end of the bargain. This is something I've always known about myself. I have commitment issues, and I tend to take on more work than I can handle. I believe this is her way of showing me to my face the very thing that I've been avoiding. It was terrifying to pull the Nine of Swords reversed in this conversation with her, because I instantly knew what she could see that I didn't want to. I've always prided myself on sticking to my commitments, but honestly, sometimes those commitments fall to the wayside, and I have to recommit to them later on. Sometimes I take on too much work because it's hard for me to say no. Sometimes I can never commit because I can't make up my mind on what exactly I want. The growth has happened, though, that I could now look at that card, see the message I had been avoiding, and learn from it instead of getting defensive and trying to push my way forward anyway. So instead of forming a contract with Bridget, I formed one with myself for the next 6 months. Maybe I'll talk about my experiences with it one day, maybe not. Spiritual growth starts out with simple questions and observations. Well, why do we do it this way? Why do I feel this way? Why do I believe this? How does this benefit me? How does this benefit my family? And then even further, how does this benefit my community? It's also going to look different for each individual. My gradual shift in spiritual perspective will be much different than the person who had a tower moment and needed to change immediately. Both shifts and styles of growth are valid, and neither one is better than the other. It's time to take a break for a second and answer a listener question. Today's question comes from S. Nicola W. on Instagram. They asked, do you work with any deities? If yes, how did you find them or start working with them? So thank you so much for your question. I personally work with and worship Bridget, the Irish goddess of the forge, poetry, and healing wells. She encompasses so much more than that, but that's a topic for another time. I don't tend to work with any other deities, but I have given offerings in passing to Angus O, the Irish god of love. Bridget came to me slowly, I think. It's a bit complicated, but I had been feeling her presence around me for a while. This was all in the time when I was slowly moving away from Wicca, so I wasn't too familiar with any other deities, and if I even wanted to approach specific deities. I had heard her name once, and it just clicked. So I did some divination, started giving her offerings, burning a candle for her regularly. Over time, I received confirmation that it was her, and that I had work to do on myself. She is a goddess of the arts, for sure, and that's what initially connected me to her. However, she is also a goddess of the forge and transformation through hard work. Think the hammer and anvil as a sword or dagger is being created. And she's helped me see the shadows that I've been hiding from. So long story short, she had been there, but on the sidelines. Divination confirmed for me that it was her, and I give regular offerings to her, honor her in my work, and face my shadows and my darkness head on to make myself a better person for whatever she has planned next. Thank you so much for the question. If you want to have your question answered during a podcast episode, check the links in the show notes or check my Instagram highlights for the Q&A story. Now, back to the topic. So with all of this work behind spiritual growth, what's the point of it all? Well, that's going to depend on what you believe. In my life, spiritual growth is about getting closer to my true self and closer to my faith. This involves a lot of shadow discovery and introspection, but it's all worth it for me in the end. When you know who you are, what causes you to react instead of respond, and what your purpose is, I find that it's easier to lead a more fulfilling life. Spiritual growth is about achieving a level of truth and honesty with yourself so that you can be more open to the opportunities around you. I don't think spiritual growth is about ascension or putting yourself above others for the sake of gaining something for yourself. For me, spiritual growth puts me closer to my gods and my witchcraft practice. Think about it. If I can't be honest with myself and own up to any mistakes or errors in judgment, how can I expect the gods to hold me to the same standards? I'm going through something like this right now with my self-contract. Holding myself accountable to myself is the first step in building a longer-lasting relationship with my gods. If I can be accountable to myself and depend on myself to get things done, then I know that I will be better prepared for whatever the gods may throw at me. For some people, spiritual growth is about growing closer to their higher selves. Again, this is getting closer to that inherent truth about who we are as people. I see spiritual growth and shadow discovery as two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. Spiritual growth is also recognizing when we're bypassing our emotions or lives with spirituality. Spiritual bypassing is when we use any spiritual practice, like meditation or even witchcraft, to cover up any emotional, physical, or psychological burdens we may be feeling. This most commonly looks like saying good vibes only, or one I commonly hear because of my mental illnesses: if you would just meditate more, get outside more, exercise, quit taking medication, you'll be fine. Yeah, no. Spiritual growth also comes in the form of realizing that there are no good or bad emotions. Emotions are just emotions. Sadness isn't a bad emotion. Anger isn't a bad emotion. Happiness isn't a good emotion. Joy isn't a good emotion. Emotions serve a purpose, and they're not something we are, they're something we experience. When we can learn to see our emotions and our reactions objectively, we can begin to be more honest with ourselves about the causes of our emotions and whether or not they are productive. In my experience, spiritual growth is heavily tied to my emotions, my psychological state, and my witchcraft and pagan experiences. I do better witchcraft when I can be honest with myself. I am a better pagan and polytheist when I can be honest with myself. Being honest with myself allows me to better focus, to see more clearly what it is that I want. If you can't figure out what you want, how do you expect to get it with witchcraft? In my pagan practice, it helps me because I can grow from my mistakes, learn when to listen, and see when my pride is getting in the way of a message or lesson that I need to learn. With all of this being said, there are a few things I find helpful in furthering my spiritual growth. One of these, and one of the most important in my opinion, is shadow discovery. Most people in the community call this shadow work, but I have since changed the term I use for this process to better align with how I do it. I talk about that actually in the workbook I'm creating for shadow discovery. But anyway, discovering your shadows is one method of spiritual growth because it brings your awareness to things that you don't want to face or that have been hidden in your subconscious by your consciousness. Working through these shadows can help you live a life more authentic to you in your truth. In working through shadow discovery, you can begin to see where certain emotions and situations stem from and how to overcome them. For me, one big one is my pride and my fear of failure. These are shadows I'm constantly working on, and I definitely feel the benefit in my spiritual practice when I can face them head on. It should also come as no surprise that I recommend keeping a journal of your spiritual practice, whatever that is to you. Many people call this a book of mirrors, some just call it a journal, but whatever it is to you, keep record of your divination sessions, keep record of your meditations. Make notes when you feel yourself getting angry or jealous or afraid. Eventually, you'll begin to connect the dots between your shadows, your fears, and your hesitations, and how they affect your spiritual practices. Another thing I can recommend for growing spiritually is connecting with a larger community, and not just those that believe or practice in the same way you do. I think it's important for all spiritual people to have a well-rounded circle of friends, seeing things from the perspectives of others, as long as we're not talking about racists, fascists, appropriators, and the like, can help you expand your understanding of the world around you and deepen your connection to yourself. It may even help you learn a thing or two. I mentioned more toward the beginning that even your family and friends and the people you surround yourself with can help or hinder your spiritual growth. If you surround yourself with people who are constantly looking for a fight, constantly within their shadows and refusing to face the truth in front of them, you're more likely to pick up on that energy and do the same thing. But if you surround yourself with people who aren't afraid to confront their shadows and who are open to criticism and discussion on certain topics, then you have a better chance of growing spiritually and learning from the people around you. No matter how you choose to approach spiritual growth, please know that this is all just the opinion of one witch and mother who has been through her fair share of trauma and crappy situations, all while building a thriving spiritual practice. Growing as a spiritual person will always be a subjective experience and will always be for different reasons. My spiritual growth deepens my connection to the gods and myself while helping me better serve the larger community. On your journey, think about how spiritual growth can help you. Thank you so much for listening to my first episode back after hiatus. I'm hoping to iron out any kinks and issues I have with the formatting over the next several episodes. I also have a few interviews lined up in the coming months, so those will be bonus episodes on top of my normal content. I will see you back with another podcast episode very soon. In the meantime, be sure to follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Check out my YouTube channel where I post videos once a week. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to help support the show and keep it going. And I would love it if you would have a peek at my shop where I create spiritual crochet goodies for hearth and home, as well as guided meditations and tarot readings. Until next time, stay magical. Well, I realized that I already messed up what I said I was going to do at the beginning with all of the segments, because I don't have a tarot card for the month of June planned out. So instead of me pulling a tarot card for June and talking about it, I'm going to give you all a little bit of homework. Today, or whenever, I want you to take a tarot deck or pick a random card that you find on the internet and look into it. Read about it. What are the symbols? What does it mean? Do you read reversals? And see if maybe there's a message for you there for the next month. And I'll talk to you soon.